Okay, in this video we're going to look at the functions of life and cell theory, and you'll be able to state and define the functions of life and outline the tenets of cell theory. And really, the question that we're looking at that's animating this whole process is what makes something alive? And it's not actually a particularly easy question to answer. Think about things that you know that are alive. Well, humans and trees and things like the grass outside as well, bats and dogs and bacteria and a fungus, a microscopic animal like a hydra, all sorts of different things, a whale. They're all alive and they're all very different. So what do they have in common? One attempt to answer this is to identify the things that all living organisms do, and we call those the functions of life. The way that I like to think about and remember these things is I draw myself something that's alive. I'm going to make this a big cell here. And then I think about all of the different things that it has to do in terms of the diagram. Well, one of the first functions of life is nutrition. You need to take in matter in order to make matter for yourself and also to release energy from it. So the first is nutrition. Let's say these are some things that you're eating. Now you're going to process that inside. And when you process that inside, it goes through all sorts of different chemical reactions that let you break down the matter so that you can build it back up into the parts of your body. And you also can release energy from it. And that process of handling matter and energy we call metabolism. And again, metabolism is how an organism handles matter and how it handles energy. And really, it's the sum of all the chemical reactions going on in an organism. I'm going to write reactions like that. So we've got nutrition, bringing in food and its contained energy, metabolism, where we use that to make our own bodies and also to provide us with energy, and then we get rid of wastes on the other side. And we're going to call that egestion. So those are our three first functions of life: nutrition, metabolism, and egestion. As well, that energy is going to be used to grow. So the organism can grow outwards. And growth is another of the functions of life. As well, the organism is going to, all organisms need to reproduce themselves, make more copies. And those copies might be identical or they might be non-identical. But in either case, they're making more copies of themselves or something similar to themselves, and we call that reproduction. So another function of life is reproduction. Organisms need to respond to their environments. So a stimulus comes in, could be light, it could be something else. Let's say light is impinging upon this cell and the cell moves towards the light. That would be an example of a response. And you can think of many other examples, but responding to outside stimuli is another aspect of life. It's another function of life. As well, we have homeostasis. And homeostasis refers to the maintenance of the internal conditions of a cell or an organism within tolerable bounds, so maintaining a relatively steady state. And an example to think about, both in terms of bodies and in terms of houses, is temperature as a function of time. If you think about your thermostat's job is to keep the temperature at a set point. Let's say you want the temperature to be 20 degrees. Now, the temperature in the room doesn't actually stay at 20 degrees. Sometimes it gets too hot, and then maybe the air conditioning comes on, and then sometimes it gets too cold, and the heat comes on, and that process repeats. And so the temperature isn't exactly the same all the time, but instead, it oscillates around a steady state. And the way that the thermostat keeps the temperature relatively steady is by cooling when it's too hot and heating when it's too cold. We call that negative feedback, where a change in the system generates a response that puts the system back towards the steady state. And we'll see a lot of negative feedback in biology. So homeostasis, again, the maintenance of relatively stable internal conditions, generally proceeds by negative feedback. We've seen this now here with a thermostat, but it also happens in your body. If you get too cold, you'll start to shiver to release more heat energy, and if you get too hot, then you'll start to sweat to get rid of some of that heat energy. So there are your functions of life: nutrition, metabolism, egestion, growth, reproduction, response, and homeostasis. I haven't really drawn homeostasis here on the diagram, but I've drawn it over here. This is the way I often try to remember it for myself. Okay, let's talk about cell theory. First, I want to just spend a moment talking about this word theory, because it means something different in science than how you're used to hearing it used. Sometimes in everyday life, a theory is just an untested speculation, but in science it means something very different. A theory is actually a very broad explanation, broader than a hypothesis, and it's something that is supported by lots of evidence. So, for example, when you hear natural selection described as a theory and people say, oh, it's just a theory, that doesn't mean that it's just idle speculation. It means that it's a very big, all-encompassing explanation, and there's lots of evidence to support it. And it generates lots of smaller potential explanations, hypotheses, as well. So that's what we mean by theory. And cell theory states that cells are the basic functional unit of life. They're the smallest things that are alive. And all living things are made of cells. And that's a testable statement. That's a statement that we could prove wrong if we found something that was living but wasn't made of cells. And yet we haven't done that. Again, back to this idea of theory, something that's a broad explanation being supported by lots of evidence. And all cells come from pre-existing cells. That is, cells don't pop into existence from nowhere, but they are the offspring of other pre-existing cells. So that's cell theory and the basic tenets, and above we did the functions of life. Thanks very much.